It's probably no surprise to you that the rich spend more. What probably would be a surprise to you is just how much more they spend, and how increasingly important that spend is to the economy and economic growth. See, as wealth gets concentrated to the top few percent, the purchasing power of those few percent goes up, because relative to them, people just don't have any money. The issue that this causes is that then the entire economy's growth is based off an increasingly lopsided picture of spending. Fox Business starts us off today. America's wealthiest households are accounting for a growing share of consumer spending as market-driven gains in their net worth fuel a wealth effect, a new analysis by Moody's Analytics finds. The report, authored by Moody's Analytics chief economist Mark Zandi, found that the top 10% of U.S. households in terms of earning, defined as making about $250,000 or higher, accounted for 49.7% of consumer spending, a record since at least 1989, according to the analysis. That figure marks a significant rise over the past 3 decades, when the highest 10% of income earners accounted for about 36% of consumer spending, Moody's Analytics found. Zandi's analysis suggests that the growth in the U.S. gross domestic product, GDP, is heavily reliant on the spending habits of the highest earning Americans. He estimated that the spending by the top 10% of earners contributed to at least 1/3 of the entirety of the GDP. And this is one of the big issues you have when you measure the economy in one big block. You miss the real picture of what individual people and the income classes are actually experiencing. And GDP specifically is an issue because it doesn't measure the economic health of the people in the economy, just the entire thing. Imagine, if you will, a household with 3 people in them who are roommates. The first one is an executive of a big tech company, makes, say, $500,000 a year. The second is a programmer, makes $100,000 a year. The third one is a teacher and makes about $35,000 per year. If you were to look at the income of the household, you would say, oh my gosh, it's like almost $650,000 of income. That household must be doing so well. Look how much money they have. But obviously that's not the whole picture, because within that household you have some people that are doing really, really well, and you've got one person, the teacher, who is barely making it by. In the same way, measuring the GDP can overestimate how well everyone is doing, because within that GDP number there are a few people doing really, really well, which is offsetting how poorly the lower class is doing. These findings come as less affluent households continue to struggle with the effects of persistent inflation, as well as high interest rates that have hit the housing market. From September of 2023 to September of 2024, when the most recent data used in the report was sourced, the highest 10% of earners increased their spending 12% in that period, while spending by both lower and middle income earners declined in that period. That is extraordinarily important. The rich are spending more, and the people without any money are spending even less. Quote, wealthier households are financially more secure and thus more able and willing to spend their income, Zandi wrote. That is, they save less than they otherwise would. This is consistent with our estimate of consumer spending by income group, which shows that the well-to-do in the top quintile of the income distribution powering the recent growth in spending. And that makes sense. If you make more money, then you can absorb inflation hits better. Sure, maybe it sucks, but all that's really happening is you're spending a little bit less money on fun things and outings probably, but you're still able to buy everything you want, and more importantly, always able to afford everything you need. Whereas if you're lower class and prices go up, you just kind of have to go without. You're forced to spend less because you can no longer justify the higher prices that things now are. KTLA 5 talks a little bit about this report, but it also says some things that I want to clarify because I think the opinions held here are probably pretty common.
You're talking about rich people are more important, at least when it comes to the economy.
Economically speaking, yeah. And not just rich girls we're talking about rich people, the top 10%. Now, first let's go into the Wayback Machine and go back to the Gilded Age in the late 19th century. That's when we had a vast chasm between the country's haves and have-nots. In fact, that ended with the economy collapsing and the country being plunged into a major depression. All right, now let's come back to where we are now. There's a new report out from Moody's Analytics saying that the top 10% of earners in this country, that is people bringing in at least $250,000 a year, now account for roughly half of all consumer spending.
See, and he mentions the Gilded Age economic collapse, and probably what I think he's talking about is the panic of either 1893 or 1896, which wasn't entirely caused by wealth inequality. America had an issue where lots of American investors had investments in overseas banks that failed, and at the same time, the national roadway system was a bubble that people continued to build and build and build until it stopped being as necessary as it was, and so that bubble also collapsed. And also at the same time, there were extremely high tariffs under William McKinley, I believe, upwards of like 50%, which made things domestically way more expensive. To be clear, there are some parallels between the panic and today. There was a large amount of wealth concentrated on the upper percent who invested it into industries that were bubbles and popped. But to suggest that that's going to happen again when the economy and regulation and just the country as a whole are essentially unrecognizable from what they were 130 years ago is, I would say, just silly. FDIC insurance alone would prevent the economic collapse we saw then by sole fact that we don't have runs on banks anymore and we're no longer on the gold standard. I'm not saying we won't have a collapse, but I'm saying it will not happen on the same terms that he seems to be referencing here.
30 years ago, their share of consumer spending was closer to a third. Now, obviously, they control far more wealth thanks to gains in stocks and property values. And as a result of that, they have far more disposable wealth than everyone else, which is another way of saying that as many, if not most Americans, are now barely getting by, scraping to pay for food and the rent and health care, the top 10% are splurging on designer clothes and handbags and expensive vacations. And in a sense, we should say thank you, because they are literally keeping the economy humming at this point.
Now, the stats he cited are correct. Most people are not able to afford something like a $1,000 emergency if it were to come up, and a lot of people are struggling just to afford basic necessities. But the issue I have is this vast overgeneralization that he has. I'm not saying that there's not an issue, but he's painting a very broad brush of the economy now and comparing it to an economy that was completely different many, many years ago. The rich are not keeping everything running as he suggests. The lower and middle class still account for about half of all economic activity. If you take them out of the equation entirely, the entire country collapses because half of all economic activity has just vanished. The rich do, however, keep a disproportionate amount of the economy running, and an even larger and more disproportionate amount of the economy running now than we've seen in recent history. That is the issue. Not that we're on the verge of some kind of collapse, but because we're seeing worrying and troublesome trends that we don't want to continue into decades to come because they may cause more problems and possibly eventually a collapse if we don't do something about it.
Consumer spending represents roughly 2/3 of total U.S. economic activity. Well, the spending of the top 10% is now 1/3 of GDP. They are keeping everything moving. But let's go back now to the Gilded Age. When you have a vast difference between the haves and the have-nots, that just is unsustainable. And an economy cannot continue moving like that because there's too much wealth concentrated in the hands of too few. And again, in the Gilded Age, we had collapse and depression. What are we heading to now? Well, I can't tell you, but I can tell you that the wealthy in this country are looking at $4 trillion in additional tax cuts.
I chose this clip because I think there are a lot of pretty common sentiments in here, in that assuredly this will lead to a collapse. And I'm not saying that it won't. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you what's going to happen. But I can tell you that people have been predicting economic collapse ever since we recovered from the 2008 crash. And it hasn't happened. I'm not saying it can't happen, but media personalities are constantly hinting that it might, because that gets clicks and is something to talk about. And kind of people are hoping for a collapse so that they can afford things again. And if it does happen, then you can say you were right. But if it doesn't happen, well, then nobody remembers or cares, and there's no accountability for fear-mongering like this. The panics of the 1890s are completely different from what we are experiencing today, in the same way that the dot-com bubble is completely different from what we're experiencing today, and the 2008 housing crash is completely different from what we're experiencing today. But to be clear, I'm not saying that this is okay or good. There are obvious issues with the wealthy running so much of the economy, with one of the main ones being that businesses, which are for profit, will just kind of stop worrying about catering to lower class customers since they're not the ones that are spending money. Think about like fine dining or theme parks. They used to have broad appeal, and now they are catered almost specifically towards the rich and are extremely expensive, and other people, without using credit cards, which they often do, simply cannot afford it. It starts with things like that, but it does expand. And kind of to highlight what I'm talking about, I found this TikTok discussing how expensive things at Disney are. Disney has never been cheap per se, but it has in the past been much cheaper than it is now. But as the rich are the ones using their money for these kind of frivolous activities like going to Disney, Disney is able to raise their price over and over because the rich have that money to blow.
Who wants to see some of the ridiculous prices we find?
$15 for a drink is not terrible, honestly. But this is where it starts to get crazy. $65 for a pair of Crocs. $85 for a sweater. Ordinary phone case, $40, probably costs about $2 to make. A pair of socks for children, $18. A small cute little handbag, $100 for a shiny Mickey Mouse handbag. Again, probably cost $5 or $10 to make in China and was shipped over here. Tiny Stitch Crocs for infants, $55. $5.30 for a Coca-Cola. It is just absurd. A little candle that says home on it. Oh, that's kind of cute. Let's take a look at this price here. $35 for that candle. You want those cute little ears for your children? $35. It goes on for a while, just listing out all the absurd prices, but you get the idea. It is simply unaffordable to anyone that does not make a lot of money. You might look at it and say, well, who's paying for this? The upper few percent that are the ones going to Disney. You may say, well, there's no way that they're the ones funding it. But when you think about how big America is as a country, 330 some odd million people, 10% of that, 33 million people, that's more than enough people to keep Disney running if they're able to keep spending huge amounts like they are. And as we see from these prices, obviously they are. Disney would not charge those prices if people weren't paying them. If everyone stopped buying Disney products at Disney, Disney would lower the prices. Now, obviously, this is not happening everywhere. You don't walk into Walmart and see $100 Crocs because primarily that's not the audience they're catering for. But as the rich are able to afford more stuff and spend more, corporations raise prices, which leaves behind the lower and middle income classes. And that's partially where inflation is, and what we've been seeing happening since 2022's huge spike of 9% in that summer. But at the same time that this is happening, people don't want their lifestyles to decline or regress, which is totally understandable. However, they start supplementing their lifestyles with credit cards so that they don't lose out on the things that they've become used to. And this leads to a debt spiral that they simply cannot get out of. And this issue is getting much, much worse.
Mortgages, car loans, credit cards. Americans are borrowing more than ever. U.S. household debt now at $17.94 trillion. For credit cards, that debt has never cost more. The average interest rate almost 22%, way higher than auto loans and mortgage rates.
I was like, holy, like it was hundreds of dollars per month. I'm like, I could be spending that on groceries.
Just in interest.
Just in interest.
And people don't realize how much interest is costing them, both monetarily and also in their financial futures. If you are paying hundreds of dollars a month in interest, that is literally your retirement that you are giving over to credit card companies. You are handing them on a golden platter your financial future to a faceless billion-dollar corporation that could not care less that you exist. The only thing you are to them are a stat and a number and a dollar amount that they think they could get from you. And every time I mention that on this channel, lots of people in the comments fly in saying that they're using it to pay for necessities. And I am very empathetic to that. But you also have to realize that insanity and reality can be the same thing. They can coexist. It can be insane that you have to go into debt for groceries. But if it's also reality, then you have to do everything in your power not to get stuck in that debt cycle. Just because I think that is horrible and I hate that that happens to people doesn't mean that that's not the case. So you need to get a roommate, shop at Aldi, take on a second job, move to a cheaper city, or find some other way to save money so that you're not handing away your future to a corporation.
Jamie Parker is chipping away at her part of the record $1.17 trillion Americans now hold in credit card debt.
I was in about $60,000 worth of debt when this all started. Just to be able to live for the year with my kids.
The marketing professional and single mother of two leaned on credit cards when she was laid off 3 different times during the pandemic.
I've really had to cut back.
Researchers at the New York Fed say wages are rising, making higher debt levels manageable for many, but delinquency rates remain elevated.
Wages are rising, not very much to be clear, but they are rising even when adjusted for inflation at a national average. But probably what's happening more is people are taking those purchases that they would normally put on credit cards, but because they're maxed out or they don't want to pay more, they're now putting it on things like Klarna, Afterpay, or other buy now, pay later services instead of the credit cards that they were putting it on. This makes it look like people are keeping up, and it helps keep their credit better because it's not being put on a credit card. But really all this does is this just hides the debt because it's not reported to credit bureaus. It's called phantom debt, and it's basically just debt that people are taking on that isn't tracked. So probably there's billions of dollars of that out there, and people are struggling more than we even are able to calculate right now because this debt is just ones and zeros somewhere in cyberspace, and we're not actively able to track it right now.
It's something that we're keeping a close eye on, just because if households aren't able to manage their debt obligations, that suggests something more distressing is happening in household balance sheets.
Jamie is now in a program to help clear her debt, paying off 2 big cards at $535 a month for the next 5 years.
That's so much
Her experience showing how with rates so high, even a little debt can spiral. Experts recommend paying more than the minimum payment, consider zero-interest balance transfer offers, and work with a credit counselor to consolidate debt.
It just takes one job loss or one interest rate spike or one emergency purchase to kind of put you over the edge.
Yes, it does. It's a very slippery slope.
Christine Romans, NBC News, New York.
It's very easy to get into credit card debt and then very hard to get out of it. It's like quicksand, and before you know it, you are up to your neck. That $535 a month that she's paying, if you extrapolate that out into how much it would have been if she had to take that and put it into a retirement account, it's probably hundreds of thousands of dollars that she's lost out on. I try not to be a doomer, but I want to be clear that this is bad and it's getting worse. The Big Beautiful Bill cuts almost $4 trillion in taxes on this upper percent that we see already able to spend more than anybody else. And they might spend it, sure, they might spend that $4 trillion, put it back into the economy and really get things going, but probably not. Billionaires have never spent themselves into wealth equality, so I don't imagine that that is going to happen this time. Thanks for watching.